very nice just sitting here in 2020 and looking back on what's happened in the past few years as Europe has moved towards a political union. Just over a year ago, the first president of the European Union was directly elected by all 450 million citizens from 30 member states. And at that time they also elected the 8th European Parliament. But electing the president cemented in the political union that accelerated after the great crisis a decade ago. That same plebiscite incorporated a balanced budget requirement into the European Constitution as the final step to make sure those debt problems could never recur again, so that all EU members can now feel secure in sharing a sound and secure currency. It's good to see the EU reaping the full benefits of the gigantic shake-up produced by that crisis, even though it was very unpleasant at the time. But the huge pressure to boost competitiveness paid off, and we're now counting the results of more than 5 years of 3% annual productivity growth, twice what was achieved before. We all knew there was a lot of slack in our approach to productive activity, but the longer-term benefits could scarcely have been imagined back then. Our population is 50% bigger than that of the US, and that surge in productivity has gone a long way to closing the gap with US productivity. Add in the fall in the dollar after the famous checks and balances of the US political system just simply failed to cope with the budget and external deficits facing them, and the EU economy is now substantially larger than that of the US. One of the benefits which we now see looking back is that the currency stability which was created and the elimination of budget deficits underpinned the low inflation in the Eurozone. And so now consumers, citizens can look forward to the maintenance of inflation of around about 2% as we've had in the last few years. Money remains sound and stable. But amidst this good news, there's one thing that everyone is rather sad about. A few years ago, the UK decided it was not willing to go down this path to closer political union, and it voted to leave the EU. Regrettably, I must say, many EU members really did embark on a campaign of what's called murky protectionism, and the migration of industrial capital investment from the UK completely undermined its competitive position. As always, they tried the old ploy of devaluing their way to prosperity, but it failed. And at £1.50 per euro, the UK is now economically fairly insignificant on the world stage. Very sad. Next year, the European Union's debt-GDP ratio should fall back below 60%. You'll remember that was the original Maastricht Treaty limit, because budget deficits were, in fact, eliminated by 2015 as a direct result of the commitments made at the height of the crisis. To the astonishment of many commentators, these were actually delivered because of the new collective powers that were agreed then. And as financial integration progresses even further, we're certainly moving down the road towards a European finance ministry where tax revenues are in fact collected centrally and distributed. There's a way to go yet. But it's amazing what a few years of good productivity growth can do for you. Equally remarkable is what happens when you fail to control public finances. The US's debt-GDP ratio will soon be twice that of the EU. Anyway, the change in old Europe's standing in the world is quite astounding. The Chinese and other large holders of US debts bailed out of them once they spotted these trends. So it's good to see that the euro is now generally regarded as the world's reserve currency. All this reminds me of the beginning of my career, when that sudden disappearance of the reserve rule happened to sterling. It proved to be a very slippery slope for the UK, and the same seems to be happening to the US. But it is a little worrying that the EU has not been willing to take on the military role of the US. Sometimes the world does feel a rather threatening place.